because according to John, Jesus was an astrologer. What's up, wizards? Today we're going to start out with chapter 10, and we have a few chapters to go through, but all in Treatise 1 of Bonatti's Book of Astrology. For those playing along at home, we're using the Ben Dykes translation of Bonatti on Basic Astrology, which covers Treatise 1 through 3, so I anticipate that will be in this book for a while. So definitely pick up a copy, written by an astrologer, well, translated by an astrologer for astrologers. He's since come up with a bit better conventions that aren't in this, but it's still great, and I highly recommend that you follow along. So, again, we enter Bonatti's super long title issue for his chapters. And this chapter is against those who said that the judgments of the stars are not of value, nor are elections of value, saying that it can be elected for the enemy just as for him whom it is elected. And the basic argument that's coming on here is to really understand that you have to understand what Bonatti did. Bonatti was a wartime astrologer, and I know some of you guys have just discovered traditional astrology is a thing, and you're plugged into sun signs, and you're like, well, what about it? What elections? What? What is that business? What's a judgment? So judgments can actually be a bunch of stuff, and a lot of times judgments refer to horaries, which is where you ask a simple question and the astrologer takes a look at the question and gives you the answer and information based on what's going on in the heavens. Most of this chapter is dealing with electional astrology, though, and electional astrology is picking a fortuitous time. So in Bonatti's case, he was picking when an army would attack, or when to start a march, those kinds of things. And so the kind of person he's coming up against that he's addressing here is someone who says, well, what use is an election? Because if you elect something and if the person who hired you starts marching at the same time as his enemy, then the election is going to be just as good for both of you. So it's really going to end up making things equal. And Bonatti really entertains this line of thinking for a bit. And the first question that he kind of puts in his little puppet is something along the lines of, well, if you have an army and there is an enemy army and both start marching at the same time and they share the ascendant, then who wins? And Bonatti says at that point, well, clearly it's the person whose host is larger, so who has the bigger army and is more skilled. And they're like, okay, fine. Well, what if they're equally as skilled and the host is the same size? And at that point, Bonatti says, well, it's going to be the person who was born, the general who was born at night. And that's because Mars is a night planet, and you're trying to do everything you can to get onto Mars' good side. So if both generals are there, they were both born on the same ascendant. If one was born at night, then they'd have an advantage because of the way that Mars is in sect, or whether it's on the night team, which we'll get into much later on, exactly how that works. And they're like, okay, well, what if they're both born at night? Then Bonatti says it would be the army that's marching from east to west, because the sun rises and goes from east to west, or is marching from north to south. And again, that's the sun's in the highest point to the lowest point. So the army that's conquering, the army that's initiating, is going to win. And at that point, they would say, well, what if one army is marching from east to west and another army is marching from north to south, and they meet in the middle, and that's how the fight starts? And Bonatti says that is stupid. That is the dumbest thing ever, and that doesn't happen. But I will entertain this thought. So if that's the case, then it's going to be the general whose part of fortune is in the direction that his army's going. And at that point, they say, well, what if both generals have a part of fortune that matches the direction that they're going? But Bonatti says, you are dumb, and at this point, you're just being contrary to be contrary. And he goes on a tirade. And that's really kind of the end of that, is he says that if you make it ridiculous and you remove it to this point where it realistically would never happen, you'd never realistically have two generals that both had the same ascendant and were both born at night, and their armies were both marching in fortuitous directions, and there wasn't anything to distinguish between the two. And at that point, he just says it's nonsense to really ask anything further, because that person's asking with a motive of making astrology look stupid. And there's really, I think that the way I would approach that is like, okay, well, show me a situation where this has happened and this isn't just hypothetical, and then we'll talk. Bonatti is not quite as kind and just says these people are dumb or malicious. The next argument that Bonatti really addresses in chapter 10 is, well, if you're so awesome and able to see the future and able to understand how fate works, then why is it that bad things happen to astrologers? Why don't you manage to avoid everything bad that could happen to you? Why do you have any kind of accident at all? And essentially what Bonatti says is that, little things like stepping on Legos is not really something that astrologers would look for. It's just not something you would think about. And if you don't think about it and you don't deliberate on it, then it's not going to be something astrology can address. And that's kind of the basics of it. He takes it a step further and says, well, what if a man's foot falls out of under them and causes them basically a trip? That's not something that you could deliberate on. That's not something that you'd have a question. Will I trip today is just not a question people ask. And I think that really highlights some of the fallibility of the human condition, and in a way that really opens up that question that Bonatti was addressing before, where he starts talking about what is possible and what is necessary. And eventually he kind of comes to the conclusion that all things are kind of necessary after they've happened. But if you're looking to the future, you're looking for possibilities, because there's a bunch of things that can happen that are not universal. So at that point, you can start looking into things, but there's a certain amount of wisdom required to do that. You have to know that you're going to be looking for that thing. And it's one of those gotchas. It's the whole, well, why don't magicians just completely get all the monies and take over the entire world and do all the things? And it's like, well, everybody has their own limitations. And in this case, if you don't think about it and you don't look at it, then it's not going to be something you notice. And Bonatti calls it something like, oh, what is it? Because it's left to the industry or caution of the wise, because you have to be wise and know those things that are going to happen. So it again bounces on. It's like, hey man, and that's part of why I'm like, hey, I'm just a journeyman wizard. I'm not a master or an expert or a teacher or a guru. Because I'm not particularly wise. I need a lot more experience before I could claim that title. And also, one of the things that will come up a little bit later in Bonatti, probably today too, and is brought up a lot in a lot of the Muslim Arab works, and a lot of the Ibn Ezra, the Jewish works, and of course, William Lilly kind of touches on it and gives a lip service. And that is that all of this is still under the control of the divine. So no one man can know everything. This is just another tool. Kind of like the way that we come to knowledge is the way we come to knowledge. And I like to think that it would complicate things tremendously if we could start to be aware of all things, because one, we would never get anything done because we'd spend all of our time analyzing charts. Two, bad things are part of the design. And that's something that I'm starting to see in the astrologies I'm studying, is there are bad things that are fated to happen, but at the same time there are good things that are also fated to happen, and there are places where people are fated to be helped, and astrology will help you help those who can be helped. But that doesn't mean in every instance you'll be able to discern that, and especially not when it comes to accidents. If you can't foresee it, you can't deliberate on it, you can't cast a chart and think about it. And that concludes chapter 10. So onward to chapter 11. So what is Bonatti doing in chapter 11? In chapter 11, Bonatti is really reaching out and defending astrology as an art, and also breaking it into two parts. The title of this is Against Those Who Said Generally that Astrology Was Not Anything, and to show that it is, and what it is. And this is where people say astrology isn't even something to study. It's a non-existent art. Don't even look at it. It makes no sense to even try to figure out astrology. And Bonatti says, oh, no. Contrary, there is a thing there, and I will show you that there is one and what it is. And at that point, he says astrology is comes from nature, because it's a study and reflection of natural movements, and nothing in nature can be truly evil or deceitful. And that's pretty much kind of where he starts. Then he starts breaking astrology up into astronomy and astrology. And this is where we find that we have flipped the definitions in the modern world. And he goes into that a little bit more in chapter 12. But he says that astrology is broken up into two parts. That there's a contemplative part, which is the place where you play with intelligence and math and stuff, and then there's an active part, which is the part of making it useful in the world. And that contemplative part is entirely around the movement of the stars, and he says that it is the rule of the stars. And the way that the rule comes into being is it can only be birthed because of those influences of the stars on the world, and the fact that the stars have these properties. And the analogy he brings up is the actual law, that law exists because justice exists, and law is an attempt to organize the world along the lines of justice, and that justice is naturally underlying anything that you attempt to do with law, which really kind of spits in the face of a lot of our relativistic worldview right now, where we're like, well, that's your truth, man. And this is going back to a more classical view where there is justice. If there was not justice, we wouldn't feel anything was unfair. Now, sometimes we're ignorant and we don't understand what is just and what is unjust. But the fact that there is this underlying truth of justice is the only reason why law can exist. And he says, much like that happens, astrology can exist only because these stars exist. And again, the contemplative part of astrology, he breaks it into like three parts. And this is where things get a little bit technical, so I'm gonna rely on the book a little bit. Here you can see me reading it. So the first of which is, so this is the three parts of which the contemplative part of astrology is broken up into. The first is numbers and figures of the celestial bodies, of their orders in the world, of quantities, situations, proportions, and quantities of their distance between themselves. So that's just the basics, knowing what's up there. The second is the motions of the supercelestials. So at that point, you need to know the motions of those bodies that we've just discussed. How many there are, all their motions are spherical, and which of them share in all the stars, which near, how many of their kinds of motion of each of them, the directions they move, which are sits, which is forward, backwards, up, down, right, and left. There even seems to be another sits, even though they may not seem of consideration in astrology, which is generation and corruption, increase and decrease, alteration and change according to place, and so on, recognizing aspects and conjunctions. And then understanding the climes, the 7 climes of Earth, and basically what grows there and what kind of cultures are produced in those climes. And that's the beginnings of seeing how these things relate. Because also you'll have to understand the space that's being acted upon if you're going to actually be able to do anything with astrology. So the contemplative part of astrology is all those things that computers typically do for us, as well as the kind of wisdom that you'd really need to kind of collect yourself in order to start looking into mundane questions and doing things like being able to understand the influence of the stars on the crops and those kinds of things. So again, this is just the very beginning. The next part we'll start talking about the active part, which is more of the astrology, and onward to the active part. So we get to dive into astronomy, which is more actually what we would consider astrology today. And Bonatti does actually use a short, mostly concise chapter title for this, which I really appreciate. I wish more of his were like this. And yes, I know I probably complain about the chapter titles too much, but whatever. I went to school for literature. Conciseness matters. Or artistic flourish. One of those two. Not clunky paragraph sentences. So what astronomy is, which is the active part. And again, in chapter 11, we really discussed what is described as astrology, which is the stuff that the computers typically do for us now. This touches on some of that as well, but it really kind of covers the basics with what does astrology do in the world, what place does it have, who practices it, those kinds of things. So what Bonatti really tears it down to, I'm totally reading again, is what astronomy is, what are its kinds, what is its office, what is its end, what are its instruments, who is its artisan, why would it be called by such a name, and in what order should it be taught. So when he goes into what astronomy is, he really talks about the judgment of the stars, and he talks about there are different ways that you can do judgments. You can do judgments by water, which is hydromancy. You can do judgments by the way that birds fly in the sky, or what kind of noises are made at various times by various animals. Entrail reading, chiromancy, palms. Our world, we use cartomancy a lot. And it's all ways of being able to read things and understand what's going on around us by the influences of those things on the oracles. And astrology is the bestest one ever, because astrology fully contains the past, present, and future in it. So all of the other ones listed just give you a glimpse based on this moment right now. Whereas with astrology, you can project as far forward in the future as you want to go, or you can project as far back in the past as you want to go. That's projecting, but maybe it is. Or you can really explore the moment, and that's part of that. That is the why astrology is special. And again, it goes back to his argument that it's the most noble of sciences because it's studying the unchanging. And then what are its kinds? At that point, he dives into understanding the position and forms of the world, the celestial circles. It also deals with the courses and motions of the planets and other stars, and it deals with the rising and setting of the signs, and also with eclipses of the sun and moon and other planets. So that is all of it. And with the what it is, I did kind of neglect to talk about Bonatti's paraphrasing of Al-Farabi, who said the science of astronomy is the science of the signification of the stars, namely what the stars would signify about many present, past, and future things in matter or subject in magnitude itself, as was said. So, again, comes down to we study the stars and what that means for the terrestrial realm. Then with the office is to understand all of what's going on with the stars when they're angular, when they're in aspect with one another, when they're succedent, cadent, all of those kinds of things. And then its usefulness or its end is being able to judge things and know the truth through inspection of the stars. We're able to pull away the veil of not knowing what happened. So because we understand these abstract causes that are really impacting the world, we can start to put together a much more robust picture of reality and understand by understanding the underlying causes, we understand the manifestation, which ends up allowing us to again understand what happened in the past, what's going on now, and what's happening in the future, which is incredibly important for us because we're always looking for new ways of being oracles. That's essentially what science is doing, is it's trying to find predictable, reproducible properties, or ways of using properties for a reproducible effect. And the astrologers have been doing the same thing. So it kind of comes down to how accurately can you know what's going on around you. And the argument being made here is with astrology, you can understand what's going on around you with a greater degree of accuracy than you could otherwise. The instruments of the science are many, but we kind of boil it down to computers and really expensive software. From our perspective, Bonatti goes into things like the planisphere, the curvosphere, and all kinds of stuff that he used. And then the artisan is the one who's able to predict the movements of the planets and understand when they're in their various places, which we'll cover that later as far as if they're succedent or cadent or what signs they're in. The astrologer is the person who understands all of that. And why is astrology called by such a name? Because asterisk is stars, and then Dykes corrects Bonatti's Greek, because Bonatti said noma, but it's nomos, which is rule. So it's the rule of the stars. So at that point, it's practical knowledge. And then what order should the science be taught? Bonatti argues that it should be taught after all the other maths. And you need arithmetic because you need number to understand the movement of the planets. You need geometry in order to measure, again, the movement of the planets, so that you can know the directions and understand speeds and those kinds of things. And then you need to understand music, which is the next level of mathematics, to understand harmony. So you have to understand number, motion, and measure. You have to be able to measure things, proportion, not geometry. And you have to understand harmony before you can fully understand astrology to be able to use it in a meaningful way. So that is the conclusion of chapter 12. So we're about to take a break away from working on astronomy and astrological definitions and dive into how astrology should be viewed by the religious, by the church fathers. And we'll get into that now. So why should the church embrace astrology instead of rebuking it and burning astrologers or censoring them? That's really what Bonatti goes to try to answer in chapter 13. And he starts with a bunch of kind of apocryphal star lore. In the way that the stories are retold, you have Abraham being a wise man and a star worshiper. And he teaches that to the Egyptians, and they take off with it. And after they take off with it, they become absolute masters of it. But that science is rooted in Abraham himself and those special teachings that God gave to him. Likewise, he taught Atlanta, and she was so good at it that people considered her a god. Also, with Atlas, the reason he was able to support the world is because he understood the way that these supercelestial bodies moved better than anyone ever had before. And that's really addressing from a mythological perspective. It fits into the Christian mythos when you start saying that all wisdom traditions are rooted in Abraham and the special insights that God gave Abraham. And then he, of course, takes it a step further because according to John, Jesus was an astrologer. And in John 11, there's this episode that is quite frequently quoted by Christian astrologers and magicians, where the apostles are like, "Yo, what do you mean we want to go to Judea? But Christ, they want to stone you there. They don't like you in Judea. That's dangerous place to go. Why would we go there?" And Jesus responds with, "Are there not 12 hours in a day?" So Jesus right there is throwing out electional astrology, because if you start your journey during the right hour, you can radically influence what happens when you arrive and what kind of journey you have. So also at that, a little bit later, Bonatti brings up that Jesus never spoke explicitly against astrology. And then he goes on a kind of a tirade against his Franciscan foil, the arch nemesis of Bonatti, who was going around saying astrology wasn't real while claiming to be a miracle worker. And Bonatti was like, "That dude's just a fool. He's not a miracle worker." They hated each other, and Bonatti spends quite a bit of time calling them fools. But it's kind of important, I think, to really look at this and understand culturally that astrology can fit into a Christian worldview and can actually go deeper than William Lilly's naming his book Christian Astrology, just nominally making it Christian. You can quote various psalms to support astrology. There's a lot of stuff, and that's not even reorganizing all of the things. And again, given my own position and things, it's very important to me that I'm able to sync up those two. My arguments are a little bit different than Bonatti's because I don't actually center the world around wisdom traditions around Abraham. I'm a little bit more heretical and synchronistic in my approach. But I think that Bonatti does make a fairly strong argument there. It's really hard to escape the John 11 incident. Also, you have the three magi clearly following astrological stuff in the whole Bethlehem episode, and they're never condemned for it. They're honored for it. And again, it's the explicit condemning of astrology does not come from Jesus. And then the Abrahamic arguments are to make it actually fit with the Jews and that kind of stuff. But I will leave it to my Jewish friends to explain that. And we will move on to the very last chapter of Treatise 1. And that will be to show that astronomy is an art, and one of the four mathematical ones, namely with the theoretical sciences. So, I'm not a fan of this chapter. The reason I'm not a fan of this chapter is because Bonatti really, really makes some bad arguments. Some really, really bad arguments. But I am a completionist, so you guys are going to get this. So the way that Bonatti goes with it is he breaks down astrology, astro, logos, star, and knowledge or statement. Or honestly, logos also proportion or rule. It's very much like the Tao. So it's like the Tao of the stars, Tao of the stars. So he kind of says, hey, see, by the words alone, it's a science, and it's part of the quadrium, which is I've already kind of covered those, but that's the arithmetic, geometry, music, and astrology. And that if you're going to discount astrology, then you're going to have to reevaluate the quadrium. The quadrium itself will be brought into question and fall apart, and dogs and cats will live together, and no one will understand anything ever again, because there can be no knowledge if the quadrium falls, and the quadrium cannot exist without astrology. But the problem is that argument fails in so many ways. First, as he established early on today in this video, in order to practice astrology, you already have to understand arithmetic, and you already have to understand harmony and measure. So you've already gotten your hands on the first three of the mathematical sciences. And that means that astrology is, and he also argues that astrology is implied because if you are measuring things and you're examining things, then naturally you'll find this truth that is astrology, ergo, bam, astrology. And that's not really how he approaches this argument. Instead, he kind of does that. And he also appeals to authority by referencing a bunch of other philosophers, and Aristotle, Jafar, like all these, all the Arabic philosopher astrologers that he can name, he names. But again, in any of you guys who have studied logic know that that's a bad, that's a really bad approach. So he does an appeal to authority. He does some kind of weird thing that I don't understand, where he just kind of reverse explodes everything because they're roughly associated with them. And I would say that instead of approaching it like that, which again I don't like, and I do like a quote here that Dykes isn't able to track down, and that is, an art is a precept which gives a certain path and a reason of acting or speaking. That's an interesting one. The other thing I do like that he does is he does quote Seneca, and basically he says that if you want to recall the past, consider the present, and foresee the future, you need astrology to do those things. Don't think Seneca was mentioning that, because Seneca also kind of came out against astrology at points in his writings, mostly because it's a distraction and it causes worry. But and it doesn't matter what happens, if nothing comes of it, it still doesn't matter. So yeah, but taking Seneca out of context, that was vaguely fair. Although it would have wrapped it up a little bit different. So give me one moment. I'm gonna try to fix this. So how would I argue that astronomy is an art and a mathematical, and with the theoretical sciences? Well, I'm gonna throw out theoretical sciences. Let's get rid of that. Let's get rid of the mathematical arts, because we don't view things through the quadrivium and the trivium anymore. That was medieval learning theory. That is not something we really subscribe to. So how can we actually defend astrology? And I'm going to try to rely on Bonatti's arguments, not my own here. So we go back to the very beginning. If you want to understand that which isn't corrupting the way that everything on the earth is, if you want to get closer to the divine, then you're going to want to understand astrology. Astrology gives you these predictable patterns that you can calculate, and if you can calculate those and you can effectively predict what's happening, astrology has made its own case for existing. Going with this, astrology being an art, and an art being a precept which gives a certain path and a reason of acting or speaking, then astrology most certainly is an art. Because if you're viewing the world through this lens, that you're assuming that there is something greater and incorruptible, that you're assuming that that this greater thing has put these bodies in motion, and the motion of these bodies is what everything springs from, whether it's Neoplatonic spirits or Arabic stellar rays. It's still something that, like, it's causing all the changes in the earth. So I would say that its position as a predictive medium is really what would justify astrology, and that's what we're going to do here. We're going to put it to the test as we encounter different pieces. So that is exactly what I'm planning to do with this. I believe that the absolute best defense of astrology is the exercise of astrology. And let's go ahead and use it and find out how much accuracy there is in it for all these events. And we're going to continue to follow along with Bonatti. Next, we're going to cover Treatise 2, which is houses and signs. And it's going to be a while before we get around to doing actual astrology. But at this point, we want astrology to really stand on its own 2 feet. I wouldn't actually do this justification. I just, at that point, it would be I'll show you how astrology is functional art. The same way that we'll eventually explore in this channel how magic is a functional art and alchemy is a functional art, and discuss those in much, much greater detail. So, with this, we go ahead and close this video and also close out Treatise 1. So, congratulations, we've completed the very first steps of a very long journey. I'll see you guys in the next video, and until then, good astrology.